All right, so we've been covering the incessant cheerleading for war against Iran pretty extensively on this show. Drawn comparisons with the buildup to war with Iraq, the threats of weapons of mass destruction, Al-Qaeda, and how could we forget the U.S. intelligence community saying that Iran now poses the #1 terror threat against the United States. And it seems that public opinion might be swaying thanks to that fear-mongering. A recent poll from The Hill shows that amongst their respondents, nearly half of all likely voters believe that the U.S. should be willing to use military force to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. 49% said military force should be used, while 31% said no, and 20% weren't sure. But while we've come to expect a certain kind of drum beating from various pundits and so-called experts here in Washington, very small but influential group, mind you, how big of a role is the media playing in this pre-war scenario? Do they seem even more eager for military action than the U.S. government itself? Joining me to discuss this is Glen Greenwald, Salon columnist and author of his new book, With Liberty and Justice for Some, How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality and Protect the Powerful. Glen, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Now, in a minute here, I'm going to play a specific clip from NBC that you chose to point out when you were writing this latest piece. But first, just on a broad base, tell me why it is that you think that the media might be pushing this even more than the government does, right? Because at the same time, we have sanctions from the government. We have Leon Panetta going on the record in interviews saying that Israel might strike sometime soon. We have the president saying that all options are, is on the table.
Well, I think, the media is obviously very close to the American government, but they're also close to other sources as well, including officials in the Israeli government, and then neocons who have been in the last government and still hold positions of great influence. On top of that, the American media, I think, is just naturally inclined to view whoever the enemy du jour is as being this kind of unmitigated evil, and reporting on its relationship with the United States in this very uncritical way that suggests that only they are the aggressors, whereas the United States isn't. It's almost like a reflexive script that you wind the American media up and they immediately start beating the drums for war. I think there's an element of excitement for them as well, on top of a sort of more base desire for good ratings, which is what happens when new conflicts and new wars start. People listen more to political reporters. When you combine all these factors together, what you get is a media that doesn't want to impede the march to war or even critically scrutinize it, but instead fuel it and jump on the bandwagon. You see it time and time again, and we're seeing it again now with Iran.
All right, so let's take a look at this example from Jim Miklaszewski at NBC. He's their Pentagon correspondent, and we're just going to play a short clip of it and then let you tell us exactly what's wrong with it if it's not obvious enough yet. Hold on.
And if Israel launches airstrikes against Iran's nuclear program, Iranian leaders have threatened all-out war. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet would be the world's first line of defense. And its commander, Vice Admiral Mark Fox, said today they're prepared to take on just about anything Iran throws at them.
All right, let's hear it.
I mean, the reason why I wrote about that is because it was really extraordinary. There's so many deceitful narratives packed into such a short clip. For one thing, they say that Iran will launch an all-out war if Israel flies over its airspace and drops bombs on its nuclear program. Well, obviously, if Israel does that, Israel has already started an all-out war by all definitions. I mean, imagine if a country did that to the United States. We would certainly consider it to be an all-out war, and yet they depict Iran as being the one who may threaten all-out war. And even more amazingly is they say the United States Fifth Fleet will be the first line of defense for the world, as though the world is being threatened by the Persian aggressors in Iran, and the United States is there to defend the world from this aggression, when in fact it's the United States and Israel by all metrics that are the aggressors in every single way. I mean, it's the United States and Israel that are threatening Iran on a daily basis. The war would start only by the United States and or Israel invading Iranian airspace and dropping bombs on their country. Those two nations have been engaged in all sorts of covert warfare already against Iran, from assassinating their scientists on their own soil to sending sophisticated viruses and cyber warfare into their facilities, to funding and arming a terrorist group, the MEK, that is an Iranian dissident group devoted to the overthrow of the Iranian government. So, and then you add on top of that the fact that the United States has Iran virtually encircled with military bases surrounding that country and almost every neighboring, bordering neighbor. And what you see is classic aggression by the United States and Israel. And here's NBC News saying the United States may have to defend the world from Iranian aggression. It's really the purest and basest sort of propaganda.
And, you know, the attitudes that we see in terms of this are really interesting, too. For example, right, we had U.S. officials coming out last week saying that Israel was, in fact, funding the MEK in order to carry out or at least play some kind of a role in the assassinations and the murders of nuclear scientists in Iran. You have some people arguing that, well, it's okay if Israel's doing it because it's for a good cause. And then I thought it was kind of interesting that Kevin Drum decided to step in here and take a look at both sides. And he basically, you know, made the following point, saying that it's still terrorism when Israel does it. So it says, still, is it terrorism? Yes. Do both sides use it? Yes. Is this, in many cases, the future of warfare? Probably yes. Is there a better alternative? That's a good question. So, you know, what's your take on that? Does everyone just start assuming that, well, that's the future of warfare, that's the way that it's going to be?
Well, I mean, as horrible as what Kevin Drum said, which is basically endorsing terrorist attacks aimed at civilians, at least he's being honest about the fact that even his side and he himself are open to terrorism when the cause is right. What I find so disturbing about it is there are dozens of Muslims, including American Muslims, who have been prosecuted for having far more attenuated links to designated terrorist organizations than a whole bunch of American elites from both parties have with the MEK, which is also a designated terrorist organization and is therefore illegal to provide material support for it. So you have leading Republicans and leading Democrats on the dole receiving huge payments from the MEK, going out and advocating on its behalf, meeting with the terrorist leaders of that organization, and the idea that they would ever be prosecuted is unmentionable. It's unthinkable in decent company, and yet it's every bit as illegal to provide that organization with material support. On top of that, if it's true, as NBC News reported, that Israel is funding and arming and training this terrorist group, then by definition, Israel belongs on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. That's the definition of a state sponsor of terrorism, a state that funds and trains and arms a terrorist group, and it's the United States that has put the MEK on the list of terrorist organizations, and here's our primary client state, Israel, openly associating with it to send this group to do terrorist attacks on Iranian soil, blowing things up and shooting scientists who are civilians. And so the double standard is remarkable. Everything the United States does in the world is justified based on the need to stop terrorism. And here's the United States' closest ally engaging in pure terrorism, and many of the leading mavens of Washington from both parties receiving money from this terrorist group and advocating on its behalf. It's really quite remarkable, and it shows just how warped and manipulated this concept of terrorism really is.
Now, I want to talk about public opinion, public perception here, too. You know, it's interesting because our intelligence agencies are telling us that Iran is the #1 terror threat to the United States, but just on small-scale attacks. However, this entire concept as to whether or not we should use military force against Iran has to do with Iran's nuclear program, which our officials are telling us that we have no proof as to whether or not they've really decided whether they want to have this nuclear program or not. But why, in that case, you know, if the drum beating specifically coming from the media a lot of the time is surrounding Iran's nuclear program, do people still buy it? Haven't we learned from Iraq? You know, don't we have enough examples there that where you start to get a little bit skeptical?
Well, one of the things that's being done in terms of the propaganda campaign is there's this sleight of hand going on, because everybody acknowledges, including Iran, that they do have a nuclear program in the sense that they're trying to develop nuclear energy, which everybody agrees is their absolute right to do. And so a lot of times what media reports will do is they'll talk about Iran's nuclear program and imply that that's a nuclear weapons program, imply that it's beyond dispute that they're actually developing nuclear weapons, even though American officials and intelligence agencies have all said that we have no evidence whatsoever that Iran has actually decided even to develop a nuclear weapon, let alone is developing one. And so this is pure fear-mongering. It's exactly the same thing that happened the way that so many Americans were convinced to go to war against Saddam by telling Americans that he was developing a nuclear weapon. It's the same thing, and that is a real question. I mean, what I looked at today was public opinion, the history of public opinion about war in the United States. Americans supported the war in Vietnam overwhelmingly and then came to view it as a mistake. They supported the war in Iraq overwhelmingly and then came to view that as a mistake. So you would think at some point they would say, we keep getting tricked into supporting these wars that actually are inadvisable and that we end up being against. Maybe we should be more skeptical the next time around. And yet the attitude seems to be, well, all of those other wars you convinced us to support were wrong and bad and a mistake, but this time we believe that this new war is really necessary and deserves our support. And it just shows the potency of fear-mongering. Fear is a very strong motivating factor in human beings. It's necessary for our evolution and our psychology, and these media reports and this constant drumbeat is designed to play on that fear, to tell people that if you don't crush the Iranians, they will crush you. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal today, an op-ed by a New York Police Department official warning that Iran may attack New York City, the most absurd and ludicrous scenario, but one that he's very sternly warning against. This kind of fear campaign is very effective, and it overrides rational faculties, and that's what it's designed to do.
Yeah, and that he also mentions that New York is especially susceptible today, right, because of the large Jewish population that happens to live there. But, you know, it definitely does seem, you know, fear plays a huge role. Glenn, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.